MMA Today Podcast Network, the Pride Never Die podcast, to do some bonus content. We didn't really get a chance to talk as much about the in-ring stuff, so I figured we'll take time to do that now. So for you, Lee, and this is obviously you're an Irishman, and this is a very American thing that we do. Who do you think the Mount Rushmore of Pride would be? Who's the four guys that when you think about Pride, these are the guys? I want yours first, and I'll give you mine.
Well, I think the first three for me are pretty easy. I think you're talking Sakuraba, Fedor, and Vanderlei. The fourth element is hard to know. I think Crow Cop is definitely in the discussion. Maybe Nogueira. Gosh, who else could you put in there? I'll pick Crow Cop.
Okay, it's interesting that you picked those three guys. My Mount Rushmore is very similar. I went with Fedor, Vanderlei, Sakuraba, and Rickson Gracie only because he kicked it off. And without Rickson Gracie, it may not have, risen to the heights that it did. Obviously, they had a lot of guys coming down the pike. You can obviously make a case for Shogun. You can obviously make a case for Crow Cop. So when I think about Pride, and I'm probably going to do this out of order, and if I, obviously you're a guy that really, without sounding like too much of an asshole here, wrote the book on Pride, right? So you're the guy that would know if I don't. So I when I think of Pride, I think of it in terms of eras, right? So I think about obviously Rickson would be sort of the first era, but then there was a there was a I don't know if you call it a Coleman era, but there was a Sakuraba era, there was a Vanderlei era, there was a Shogun era, there was a Fedor era. Do you look at it in those terms too? Like from a distance, and the reason why I say this is from a distance, I just remember as I would check in with Pride, I'm like, okay, who's kicking ass right now? All right, it's Vanderlei Silva. He's beating everybody up. Okay, it's Sakuraba. And I remember someone on Sherdog put together a highlight package of like all the guys that Sakuraba taken out with, Henzo and Vitor and all these guys. Is that kind of how you process it in terms of those eras, or did I miss anybody?
No, I think you're right. I would more or less process in those terms. I think that I'd maybe separate a little bit by weight class. I think that, and I do say this in the book, kind of Vanderlei and Fedor would be the two dominant figures, I think, for most of the promotion's history. But I think you're right. Yeah, I think the initial cards, certainly, yeah, they revolved around Rickson. And then quickly, Sakuraba became kind of a star too, and he kind of arose. And and that's the thing. And I think of it very much around rivalries and kind of. So I think that initially, yeah, the Takadas, Rickson one carried it for maybe the first 1 or 2 years. I think then they had a little bit of a lull before I think you probably see the emergence of Sakuraba, and I think the openweight Grand Prix, even though Coleman won it, I think you probably are seeing that the fact that Sakuraba emerged as the real kind of star out of it. I think it's fair to say, and and then I think that he had that run then, 1 or 2 to 3 years where I think he was he was a huge star and really part of the prominent in the promotion. I think the more Vanderlei kept defending the title and kept destroying guys, he became the real coming force there. And I think particularly after the second fight, I think that was kind of put a cap on their rivalry a little bit. But yeah, that would be how I would think about it very much is in terms of the rivalries and the fighters, I think, as much as anything else,
And a lot of it, like we talked about, in the actual meat of the podcast, was that some of this was, the early days were carried by Shamrock and Don Fry and Gary Goodrich and Gilbert Ivell and those kind of guys that kind of brought the eyes and sort of that the end. I don't want to say the end of that was almost the 2000 Grand Prix, but after that you started to see the emergence of some of these guys like you're talking about. So I'll just throw some names at you. You tell me if you think some of their best years were in Pride, and what sort of the lasting memory for you is. Let's start obviously with the guy who's widely regarded as the GOAT. Most of that was done in Pride, Fedor. When you think of Fedor as a fighter in his time in Pride, what springs to mind?
I think the fights with Nogueira, particularly, he fought him 3 times. They fought for 40 minutes, and Fedor just completely dominated him. Somebody who had been such a great champion and was able to defeat Crow Cop, Heath Herring, and loads of others just through, and Bob Sapp, through kind of submission skill. But Fedor really just beating him at his own game. And Nogueira was a good boxer too, and still outboxing him. I think for me that's probably Fedor's greatest achievement, on top of beating Krokop as well himself, and many of the other fights that he had too. So yeah, that's kind of what I'd say about him.
And he did have kind of, he wasn't necessarily an imposing figure. He fought a little bit like a welterweight or a middleweight at heavyweight. He always seems like he was fighting bigger guys, and he did a lot of work off his back, had good hands. Let's talk about Crow Cop. I mean, when the first time I ever saw Crow Cop, first time I ever watched him kick somebody in the head, it was like, this is the most menacing individual I've ever seen. Sometimes you process fighters in terms of who would I least likely to want to be hit by, and Crow Cop certainly, shot to the top of that list whenever you saw him. When you think about Mirko Crow Cop, what do you think?
Yeah, I think coming up short, I think, unfortunately, with some of the very top fights, again, against Nogueira and Fedor, but really super destructive with very good fighters. So the likes of Heath Herring, Josh Barnett, even Fujita. Fujita's wasn't a striking fighter himself, and Krokop beat him twice. So, yeah, and also kind of beating Vanderlei, probably would have lost that first fight on points, maybe if there was points, but obviously beat him the second time too. So yeah, I think just really a very destructive presence, but I think having strengths that could be nullified. I think Nogueira nullified them by allowing him to kind of get tired and then catching him, and Fedor just nullified him through sheer skill and grit. So yeah, I think really, again, I think somebody very great and iconic. Um, Unfortunately, I guess the record historically will show that maybe within Pride, unfortunately, he came up short just with those real heavyweight title shots that he got.
Absolutely, yeah. We move on to Mauricio Shogun, who obviously his success in the middleweight Grand Prix is sort of the thing. Only a handful of guys have won these really big tournaments. That are kind of like, there's only so many of them, and only so many guys have really went through them. When you think of Shogun, is that really the best Shogun we ever saw? Was his time in Pride?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you look at the UFC, he was fighting tougher guys on a more regular basis, and putting on great fights with the likes of Dan Henderson and so forth. Um, that was, you know, I do wonder if he'd started out in the UFC, and if there was more effective management of him. I think the shoot box stuff, the fact that those guys like really kind of wailed on each other, I think that might have had some part to play in terms of how his career ended up going. But yeah, he was such a dominant force in Pride. Like Ricardo Arona, like I think beat Vonner like pretty fair and square, and Shogun beat him pretty comprehensively too. So yeah, I think that he definitely had some of his greatest moments there. I think it would have been nice to see, if he'd come along a few years later and maybe had Sodi with him with the UFC, it would have been interesting to see what he would have become. But yeah, I think still a guy that you'd say has a serious legacy in the promotion.
Absolutely, and just for a little bit of housekeeping, I mean that middleweight Grand Prix, it was Rampage Jackson knocked him out with soccer kicks in the first round. He beat Rogerio by decision, knocked out Alistair Overeem, and knocked out Ricardo Arona. I mean, that's a pretty impressive run en route to a tournament victory. All right, let's move on to Vanderlei. Again, when we talk about Vanderlei, I mean, he was truly, guys that saw him in the UFC don't really understand what the Axe Murderer was all about. I mean, you hear that name and you think, okay, I mean, he embodied that name in Pride. He was a headhunter of the highest degree. When you think about Vanderlei Silva in Pride, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think again, it's that destructiveness of Crow Cop, but obviously, like highly successful and efficient from a sporting perspective, and someone who was able to defend his title, really well. I think even before the Arona fight, which I think that was then his first loss at middleweight. He'd lost to Mark Hunt before that for years. I think even before that, there was signs that there was a game plan to stop him, which I think relied on grappling a lot. The one fight I would say is the first Yoshida fight that he had. Yoshida came, pretty close to putting him in serious trouble. And I think if Yoshida had done that, I think he would have been, a massive star. That if you look at that match, the crowd just goes insane. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to get the job done. And yeah, so I think that pretty heavily dominant. I wouldn't say as dominant as Fedor, because even during those fights, there was no real sense of how you could defeat Fedor within his matches. There was some of that hint from Wanderlei, even within matches that he won. So, yeah, I think when the decline kind of started around that second Pro Cup fight and around that fight against Hendo, I think that's you know the signs were already there that he was someone who was a bit more fallible, but still obviously some spectacular achievements and some great fights.
Absolutely. When you talk about a run, so let's talk about Wanderlei's run for a second. It starts nearly 4 years. Starts December 23rd of 2000, runs till October 31st, 2004. In that time period, he decision win Dan Henderson, knocks out Sakuraba, knocks out Sakuraba twice, draw with Mirko Cro Cop, defeats Sakuraba a third time, knocks out Quentin Jackson, and knocks out Quentin Jackson twice. That's just the names, and that's not even to mention all the the Japanese fighters he went to. I'm just talking about the fighters that fans readily have available to them. But it's interesting to me, sort of how he reinvented himself in Pride. I mean, the last time we saw him in the UFC, well, there was when Vitor Belfort absolutely just ran through him in the UFC, and then he fought Tito Ortiz, lost to decision in Japan. And then it's like, you're like, well, okay, this guy can't beat Vitor Belfort. He runs through him. Can't beat Tito Ortiz. That might be it for him at 205 or 185 pounds. Then he goes to Pride and completely reinvents himself. So fascinating career for him. Up next, Kazushi Sakuraba. We just talked about him getting knocked out by Wanderlei Silva, but he had a fantastic career outside of his fights with Silva. When you think of Sakuraba, obviously you're a pro wrestling fan as well. He brought a lot of showmanship to Pride, brought a lot of great fights to Pride. What do you think of when you think of Sakuraba?
Yeah, I think it's that, and I think it's the iconic and spectacular submissions, obviously of Henzo, excuse me, of Henzo, of Rampage, Kevin Randleman as well, managed to catch him as well. And yeah, like I think, again, it's a guy that I think we should assess, his achievements a certain way, because really he was fighting guys that, in the modern era and UFC and all that kind of stuff, he wouldn't, because I think he's around 85 pound, maybe 85 kg or so forth. Like, he would have fought basically as a welterweight or maybe even lower, if those weight classes existed, and he was fighting guys that were middleweights and higher. So I think he really deserves a lot of credit for doing that. I think part of his problem in terms of his legacy was he was just pitched into like impossible situations, and I think didn't always necessarily have control over himself and control over his career, because he was managed by Takada, who was also part of the Pride backroom team. I think he was very reverent towards the hierarchy, probably to his own detriment. I think that he could have been protected, and he could have been had maybe a bit of a longer run than he had. But again, yeah, I think that someone particularly defeating, I think the Henzo fight is extremely impressive, along with the other Gracie fights. And yeah, just somebody I think we should assess as being in the conversation for maybe greatest ever, but certainly really a great fighter. And I think he deserved his space in the Hall of Fame. It's great to see him go in there from the UFC.
Absolutely, I was there, and he was the guy that I was a huge fan of his when he fought in Pride. I thought the thing that made him interesting was he brought components of his wrestling background or pro wrestling background. Like, he would get into situations and out of situations in very interesting ways. He kind of had he reminds me of Bas Rutten a little bit, in the sense that Bas was very self-taught with his submissions, and the way he would figure his way through things and say, okay, if this makes sense, then that has to make sense. You'd see a lot of that in Sakuraba, sort of chasing things and looking for different openings and saying, okay, this is a way, and sort of cartwheeling and into certain positions that other guys would take 5 or 10 minutes to get to by trying to go a traditional way. I also kind of like that he never really showed. He respected fighters, but he didn't over-respect them. So if it meant that I had to start to pull Royce Gracie up by his gi, and then I'll do that, where someone else would never think to do that. So some of the ways that he would kick, or you saw the necessary disrespect to be victorious, but still showed the respect of a fellow warrior. That's kind of the vibe I got from Sakuraba. All right, let's talk about Quentin Rampage Jackson. I think that although he is definitely someone who is on many people's highlight reels in a negative way, I think that he sort of started to establish what would be his brand as really this just badass, sneering kind of guy in Pride, carry that over to the UFC. Obviously, he came right to the UFC and captured a belt and made a lot of money and got a lot of fame in the UFC. Do you think that his legacy in Pride is one of more for his losses, or do you think he had some substantial victories? Is it really just the Chuck stuff that sets his legacy?
Yeah, I think it's probably that Chuck fight is, yeah, maybe his biggest contribution, and they knew what they were doing because, excuse me, sorry, because by matching him with Chuck, you know, they knew that Rampage would be able to kind of nullify his strengths and use his grappling, and that's exactly what he did, you know. And yeah, I think so much part of it was definitely the development of persona. Rampage was marketed in a really crazy way initially when he went into Pride. Like they claimed that he was homeless. Like they claimed that he was homeless and kind of wandering the streets and foraging for food in bins and that kind of stuff. Which, you know, Rampage Rampage has got a really fantastic attitude towards this stuff. Obviously that's pretty negative, but he was like, yeah, you know, it was a gimmick, whatever. And I think he understands. Did some pro wrestling as well himself at one time. He understands the importance of building a persona, and that's really demonstrated in Pride, you know. But yeah, I think from an in ring perspective, yeah, I think those that fight against you know, Chuck was one of the high points. And look, you know, I mean, going up against Vanderlei and at least presenting some form of a threat to him initially, I think was a somewhat of an achievement. And when a guy's on a run, you know, I mean, how many times do we say this? Well, like, oh, this guy fought Anderson Silva. Well, he didn't beat him, but you know, he still was a title contender for him, and that's sometimes how it is. Is when as a guy who's on a run, it's very hard for you to establish your name over him. That's just how MMA goes, I think. But certainly, yeah, I think it was very much the start of Rampage's career and where he established himself.
And then finally, let's talk about Minotaur Nogueira. We touched on him earlier, and he kind of reminds me a little bit of Crow Cop in the sense that he had to sort of be a foil for Fedor Emelianenko in the sense that if not for his success in every fight that wasn't Fedor Emelianenko, it doesn't really lend legitimacy to the Emelianenko victories. Do you think that? I mean, obviously he's a UFC Hall of Famer. And the interesting thing about all these fighters that we've talked about so far, and you know, we haven't even really talked about Dan Henderson. We may not get to him. Haven't talked about Anderson Silva. May not get to him. You can make a case that all these guys are going to go in the UFC Hall of Fame. So, and they were all fighting at the same time in Pride. So, what are your when you think about Minotaur Nogueira? What's your lasting memory about him?
I think two things, and one is obviously incredible grappling skill, and even though he was the one, it's strange. He was at this era where guys were becoming more well-rounded, and he was incredibly well-rounded because he had great boxing as well as great jiu-jitsu. But still was able to just pull off submissions that I don't think would be pulled off today, just purely because people are just far too wise to it, you know, and people train too hard in jiu-jitsu to avoid, you know, submissions a little bit more. And yeah, I think that's really incredible. And for me, you know, and all those fights he won by submission, like those are really incredible achievements again, because I think it would have been easy to win by decision, you know, by taking maybe the path that some of the wrestlers took of taking a guy down, controlling him, and kind of being him up for until time expired. But you know, he went out and finished guys, and in a lot of cases, you know, he took a lot of punishment along the way, and he deserves credit for just how tough he was. You know, he really was. You know, Boss Rutan talks about it in the book. He just said like the guy, you know, survived getting hit by a bus when he was a kid, so he's incredibly tough. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. Him and his brother, they both are. You know, I've always been pretty curious about the way the MMA landscape sort of community views Ruggiero. But yeah, Minotauro for sure, like you said, he got in there, he mixed it up, a lot of comeback fights. I want to finish up with Dan Henderson, and we'll talk about Anderson for a second for a very specific reason. But Dan Henderson obviously held 2 belts in Pride. If I'm not mistaken, he left the promotion with both belts. What? So obviously you can't not mention a guy like that. Do you think that, again, he had some big highlight wins and some big highlight losses? Do you think that what do you think his legacy is in terms of his time in Pride?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the win over Wanderlei was huge. The win over Vitor as well was big as well, and yeah, I think that yeah, a guy who kind of came in. I think he participated in the UFC obviously before and after. But yeah, was quite a big part of Pride. I think he never kind of reached a level of notoriety or stardom because I think that's not quite his personality. You know, I think he's very much about sort of getting in the ring and fighting, and that was what he was always about. Um, but yeah, I think a huge legacy in terms of um, having a template that I think a lot of guys follow now, where you know he has one shot that he knows if he hits, may you know probably more heavier weight classes than middleweight or welterweight. Having one shot that he knows if he hits, then the fight's over. Yeah, I think that's kind of what he contributes to the sport there.
And I'll get out of here with Anderson Silva only for one reason. I mean, his time in Pride is largely forgettable, and he may be the greatest fighter of all time. So I think that in and of itself says a lot about Pride. What do you think about the fact? And listen, he only fought like I think maybe 4 or 5 times in Pride. Never really fought a big name. Maybe Carlos Newton, if you want to call Carlos Newton a big name. In terms of that's the guy that sticks out on his maybe the Rio Chonin fight, which he lost. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that the greatest fighter of all time was in a promotion and kind of an afterthought, right?
Yeah, and I think for him it was timing. You know, same with Shogun, same with Wanderlei, and this kind of thing was just timing. And for him, it became a little too early. I think he was training with shooter box guys at the time. That was his camp, and that was kind of what brought him in. And yeah, like look, not a whole lot of a legacy in terms of who he fought and who he beat. But an interesting start, I think, and something that you know from his perspective, it's probably lucky he didn't fight too many times in Pride because he may not have been able to beat the likes of Wanderlei or whomever, and didn't take too much punishment in the promotion and had a lengthy run in the UFC. So I think it's one of these things where God closes a window and opens a door, and I think for Anderson that was it. He didn't necessarily have that great legacy in Pride, but as a result, he was able to build on what he had in the UFC.
And it's interesting you say that like he was a guy who left Pride really before a lot of the other guys left and sort of made his way into the UFC. And when he left, it was almost, I don't want to say grooved for him, but it was like, Lieben, Franklin, all these bad matchups for his opponents. He was almost like, if you took a guy from Mars and put him on Earth when the rest of the Martians haven't gotten here yet. Like he was the first Martian, and before the rest of them got here, he was just running through guys. It was like, here's a guy who sort of cut his teeth a little bit in Pride, but the Pride guys hadn't come over yet. So he's facing guys that he's seen, things or trained with guys that they haven't seen yet. So yeah, I think Anderson, his UFC run was really more signified by when he was able to leave Pride than sort of what he did in Pride. All right, guys, there you have it. I mean, I said it before. I'll say it again. He wrote the book on Pride. So let me. I don't want you to go through the whole plug again, but tell folks where they can follow you. Tell folks the website, of course, and then we'll get you out of here, Lee.
Yep. beforeafallbook.com, and on Twitter and Facebook, it's Before a Fall Book. So Before a Fall Book, all one word.com. Thank you.
All right, thanks for your time, and we'll hope to talk to you as soon as the book comes out. I'm sure it's going to be huge. I'm sure everybody will read it, and we're certainly glad that we got to talk to you before it came out, so we could help kind of get the word out.
Thanks, John. Real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Take care, Lee.
Cheers.